Hello, my name is Lewis. I'm going to be doing another controversial Bible story video, and I'm going to jump right into it. I'm going to be reading from Deuteronomy chapter 7, and it says, "When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than yourselves. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you, and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. But thus shall you deal with them. You shall break down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars and chop down their asherim and burn their carved images with fire." All right. So the passage in question is a passage in the Old Testament where God commands the Israelites to wipe out these 7 culture groups that are found in the land of Canaan. And so the question is, why would a loving God allow, or in fact require, the genocide of these tribes, of these nations that are within the land of Canaan? Is it possible for God to both be a loving God and someone who commands genocide? Now, we have to kind of unpack this a little bit. So the first thing that we have to unpack is what it means to be a loving God. And we can't allow ourselves to have a simplistic understanding of love. See, in our culture, a lot of times we interpret love to mean that a person essentially accepts me the way that I am and essentially doesn't, and that's essentially the extent of it. It's love regardless of who I am, how I act. That's essentially what love is. Now, the issue with that is, if a person does accept you that way, what if you're living a self-destructive lifestyle? What if the way that you're living is going to lead you down paths that are bad for you? Does that person actually love you if they just accept you the way that you are? So, let's take the example of somebody who's caught up in a drug habit. If you're caught up in a drug habit, right, and it's a really bad drug habit, you're addicted to heroin or something to that effect, it's an intense addiction. Do you need somebody that's just going to tell you, "Oh yeah, you're great the way that you are, don't worry, don't change, I love you anyways"? Does that person actually love you, even though your next hit might essentially kill you? I would argue that that person doesn't love you, and I think that the biblical perspective on love is that's not what love looks like. Love actually wants what's best for you. And when you're talking about God being a God of love, you're talking about a being that is that is over all of humanity. And so when he's taking into consideration what's best, he has to take into consideration the whole of humanity. Now, then that leads to another question. Can what's best involve wiping out an entire people group? So one of the things that we have to keep in mind here in regards to the people groups that God has the Israelites destroy is that this has nothing to do with race. Race gets tangled up in these issues of culture when it's really not fair to do so. There's a difference, just to take a random race, for example. There's differences between African people versus African Americans who are born in America. There's a difference between the cultures. They're not the same people. They have the same race, but they're not the same sorts of people. They're not being governed by the same kinds of ideas. And so that's the difference between a race and a culture. And so what God has a problem here in regards to these people, it has nothing to do with their race. It actually has to do with their culture, the ideas that undergird their culture. And he talks about those ideas, and I actually think that they're ideas that any modern person has problems with. Um, because the ideas that undergird the culture of the Canaanites, one of the most egregious is something that we discussed in our last controversial Bible stories video, is the idea of child sacrifice. That was intimately intertwined into their culture. The idea that you have to appease the gods by sacrificing your children to them, and in very gruesome and horrific ways. They also had a practice of ritual prostitution, where essentially women were priestesses for the gods, and essentially the men would come and they would actually sleep with these women, and that would be their pathway to connecting with the gods. And these women, a lot of times, they had no say in the matter in terms of whether or not they were going to be ritual prostitutes. That was their lot in life. And I don't think that any modern person thinks that it's okay for us to take little girls and train them to be prostitutes as they get older, and essentially have men sleep with them however it is that, whenever it is that they feel like it, so that they can have a spiritual experience and connect with their gods. So again, these are ideas that are intertwined with the culture. Now, is God making this decision lightly in terms of destroying these kinds of cultures? The answer to that is no. If you go a little bit earlier in the Bible to Genesis chapter 15, it tells the story of this vision experience that Abraham has with God. And it's actually where God promises Abraham that he's going to raise up a nation from Abraham, something that we talked about in our last controversial Bible stories video. And so Abraham is having this vision, and it says this: "And behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abraham, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. So the idea here is that Abraham's children, which are eventually going to become the nation of Israel, they're going to go off to another land, a foreign land, which is Egypt, and they're going to be slaves there for 400 years. Now, why are they going to be slaves for 400 years? God is actually going to tell us why. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." Now, why does that matter? What is God trying to get at here? The point that God is making here is that the people groups that are in the land of Canaan at the time that Abraham is alive have not reached the pinnacle of corruption. And so God is actually giving them a period of 400 years in which they can actually correct their culture so that it's not filled with these horrible ideas, because if they do, then they won't have to receive judgment. They won't actually have to be destroyed. But God knows that that's not going to be the case, but he's still going to let it play out for 400 years. He's going to let this culture, get as decadent and as wicked as they wish to be. And then at that point, he's going to bring the Israelites in as an instrument of his judgment to destroy them. And so God is not making this decision lightly. Now, even us in modern days, we can think about a culture that is so horrible that we might actually consider it being a good thing that it be wiped out and destroyed. So let's take Nazi Germany, for example, right? Now, Nazi Germany was destroyed essentially in its infancy. It only lasted, a little over a decade. And thank God for that. But you have to imagine, let's try and imagine a culture in which Nazi Germany, instead of trying to go out and conquer Europe, it just stayed isolated within the borders of Germany, and it cultivated the ideas that that Hitler had ascribed to, and it teaches those ideas to their children, and those children teach those ideas to their children, and those children teach the ideas to their children, and so these ideas are passed on. And let's say that this is going on for 400 years. To what degree is that culture going to become so corrupt that it's actually affecting everyone else in the surrounding environment, in the surrounding area? Well, this is the same thing that we have to think about with these kinds of with some of these ancient cultures. And the thing is that, again, it strikes us as modern people as inhumane to destroy a culture. But what if the culture is so inhumane itself that the only humane thing to do is to destroy it? What if that's the only way to keep evil contained, and to keep evil from spreading outward to the point where it's completely destructive to all of the nations that are surrounding it? And I think that that's actually what God is trying to accomplish here. And there's this quote by C.S. Lewis where he kind of castigates modern man, and he says this: "The ancient man approached God, or even the gods, as the accused person approaches his judge." So the idea there, right, is that God is actually the supreme authority. He's the one that has the purview, the objectivity to look at all of humanity as equals and judge justly. So that's how the ancient man approached God, because that's what God was to them. For the modern man, the roles are quite reversed. He is the judge and God is in the dock. He is a quite kindly judge. If God should have a reasonable defense for being the God who permits war, poverty, and disease, he's ready to listen to it. The trial may even end in God's acquittal. But the important thing is that man is on the bench and God is in the dock. Now, what's terrifying about that is that from the perspective of the ancients, again, God is the only objective party because he's in the heavens. He sees all of humanity. Again, he's a being that has all of time at the disposal, within his hands, and so he can see all of time stretched out before him. He understands, how decisions are going to affect humanity, versus man, which is limited. Each of us is a limited individual. We only have the purview of our own experiences. All of us filter our experiences through a personality, and so all of us, are flawed vessels for interpretation of events. And so what's scary about the idea of man putting God in the docks is that in this scenario, the limited person doesn't act as a as a just judge to a God who is actually capable of seeing the full scope of the story. And man, ultimately, in my estimation, should not be assuming that sort of a role. That's why I think in Christianity we're taught that we should not judge unless we want to be judged, because the reality is that we're too limited to judge. We don't understand enough to judge. And so ultimately there is a judge who is able to understand. Now again, just as I talked about last week, if you don't accept the idea that there is a God, that's fine. That's between you and God. But if you're reading the Bible and you're going to say that the Bible is inhumane because it has a God that allows for war, and not only allows it, but actually uses war as a tool, you have to again take into consideration what sort of God the Bible is talking about, because it's a God with the ability to be the supreme objective party. And so if a supreme objective party can look across the landscape of the earth and is a truly loving being, that being will actually decide what is best for all of the earth versus just this one section of the earth. And that loving being might sometimes actually have to implement methods that might actually not appeal to him, but he still has to implement them in order to curb the spread of evil and in order to protect the whole of the earth, which is his responsibility. His responsibility is to everyone and not just to a limited group of people. And so in closing, I actually kind of want to delve into what a takeaway for Christians might be in respects to that, in respects to this idea. First of all, if you notice from that passage, God actually tells the Israelites that if they don't do what God says, essentially what God promises to do to those nations, he's also going to do to the Israelites. And eventually, as you read the Old Testament, that story actually plays out, because the Jews continuously give in to idolatry, and God actually gives them centuries before he actually executes judgment as well. So he's just as fair with the Israelites as he is with the Amorites. But in the same way that he judges the Amorites, he judges his people, the group that he uses to impose judgment. He then takes a group of pagans who are not his people, and he uses them to impose judgment on his people. So God is in all ways just. The same way that he treated these Amorites, he also treats the Jews, because the Jews do the same things that the Amorites do, and their culture degenerates to the point that God has to do the same sort of thing. Now, for modern day Christians, what does that mean? What sort of takeaway can we get from a story like this? You know, a story that's filled with violence, that's filled with destruction, that's controversial, obviously. What can we as modern Christians take away from this story? Well, if you're a Christian, obviously there's different perspectives on this, but typically we believe that the church is, in a sense, a continuation of what the nation of Israel was. The nation of Israel was God's representative on the earth. Now the church is God's representative on the earth. And so what can we take away from that? Well, what we can take away is, if the church is not acting in a manner that is glorifying God, then the same thing that God does to our enemies, then God will do the same to us. And so maybe we should ask ourselves questions sometimes when our churches start losing our young people, or our churches start dying, our churches are not functioning in the way that we wish them to function. Why might that be? Might it be because we're not doing what it is that God says? And so God is saying, well, then you're getting what you deserve. I have no interest in having a church on the earth that acts in this manner and misrepresents my name. And so I'm going to, in the same way, pass judgment on this church. Now, obviously, that's not going to be the case for every single situation. Just because you're in a bad situation, that doesn't necessarily mean that God is punishing you. And that shouldn't be the takeaway from this story, but it should be the takeaway that sometimes that is what's happening, is we're doing things that are wrong, and the end result of that is judgment from the objective, loving creator of the universe. I hope that was helpful, and I love all you guys. Thank you so much for listening.